For most of her life, Esther Whitlow had done what was asked of her. She cooked, she listened. She stayed silent when the men in her life talked over her. At 52, she still believed in kindness, but she'd stopped expecting it to be returned. So when a man wrote her from Sweetwater Ridge asking if she'd come west to be his bride, she ironed her best dress, packed her mother's thimble, and boarded that train with more hope than luggage. But what she didn't know was the man was never real, just a name on a letter, just a cruel joke in a small town that never imagined the woman they'd laugh at might actually show up. When Esther stepped off that train, she carried herself with quiet dignity. But the crowd on the platform, they pointed, whispered. A boy snickered loud enough for her to hear. Guess he didn't mention she was this fat. No one came forward. No voice called her name, until a ranch hand standing near the horses looked up and didn't look away. He didn't smile. He didn't offer pity. He simply tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, I don't think that fella was ever real. But I've got a wagon if you don't feel like standing in the dust." And that's how it started. Not a rescue, not a romance, just the smallest, most radical act a woman like her had ever received, being seen and not being turned from. But who was that rancher? Why did he care? And what would happen when a woman who spent her whole life apologizing finally stopped? Stay with us. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about dignity, about healing, and about love that doesn't arrive young or perfect, but right on time. Would you like to hear what happened next? The train groaned into the dusty station of Sweetwater Ridge, coughing steam like an old man clearing his throat. It was a small stop, just a bench, a postmaster's shack, and a crooked sign hanging by one chain. Most passengers passed through. Few got off. Esther Whitlow, 52, stepped down with quiet dignity. Her shoes were polished. Her gloved hands trembled just a little as she clutched her case. She wore a soft blue dress with tiny pearl buttons, hand-sewn, mended twice at the hem. Her hat was simple but pressed. Hope was folded neatly beneath her collar. She had answered a mail-order bride ad from a man named Warren C. Maddox, whose letters had been flowery, affectionate, and insistent. "You sound like the kind of woman who knows how to make a home feel like Sunday morning," he had written. She didn't tell anyone in Missouri she was leaving. There had been too much laughter behind her back the last time she tried love. At the station, a small crowd gathered not to greet her but to stare, whisper, point. A boy snickered and muttered loud enough to hear. Guess old Warren didn't say she'd be this big. His mother hushed him, but not with much effort. Esther stood taller. She had heard worse, been called worse. And yet, when the hour passed, and then another, no man came forward. No voice called her name. No one claimed the woman who had crossed half the country in faith. Until finally a ranch hand in a loose shirt stepped up. He didn't smile, didn't speak at first. He just tipped his hat, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Ma'am, I don't think that fella was ever real." That's when she realized the address he gave her on the envelope was just a stable now abandoned. A trick, a joke, a scam, and she the punchline. But the man didn't walk away. He stayed, quiet, still. And he never once looked away from her. What does a woman do when her last thread of hope is cut in front of everyone? The man's name was Silas Boone. He was tall, with the look of someone more familiar with horses than with words. He spoke slow, walked slower, and carried the kind of quiet that didn't need to prove itself. When the crowd began to thin, when even the station agent had muttered something about charity cases, it was Silas who spoke again. "You don't have to stand here, ma'am. I got a wagon. Not much, but it's dry." Esther looked down at her gloved hands, still clutching that valise like it could make her disappear. "I'm not asking for pity," she said. Silas nodded. "Didn't think you were. I'm offering company. Just in case you don't feel like being stared at alone." She hesitated, then followed. His wagon smelled of hay and tobacco and dust. Not unpleasant, not polished, just real. They didn't talk for the first few miles. The road stretched long-lined with broken fences and the low hush of wind through prairie grass. Finally, she asked, "Why did you come back to the station, I mean?" He shifted in his seat. "Went to send a parcel. Saw you standing there. Saw the way folks looked at you. Pause. And saw you didn't look away." She blinked. That answer held more kindness than entire chapters of her life. They arrived at a small ranch nestled behind a ridge with a crooked barn and a front porch shaded by cottonwoods. It wasn't grand, but it had roots. Silas offered her the guest room. "Belonged to my sister before she passed," he said. "It's clean. You can stay as long as you need." Esther sat on the edge of the bed that night, dress still on, gloves still clinging to her fingers like armor. She stared at the oil lamp. Its flame was small but unwavering. She thought about Warren C. Maddox, whoever he truly was. Maybe a prankster, maybe a liar who liked the taste of hope on someone else's tongue. She thought about the letters she'd saved, tied in ribbon, now worthless. And then deeper, she thought about her first marriage long ago. The man who called her useful, but never beautiful. The baby she lost at 28 weeks. The door that closed and never opened again. The shame that grew like rust in silence. Silas didn't ask questions. He just left a folded blanket on the rocker outside her door, and a slice of cornbread beside it. It was the first kindness she had received without expectation in nearly 20 years. And she wept. Not because she was weak, but because someone had seen her fall and didn't turn it into a sermon. How does a woman relearn worth when all she's known is to apologize for taking up space? It had been 4 days since Esther arrived at Silas's ranch. She had started helping with the hens, feeding them each morning, gathering eggs with surprising care. She swept the porch, folded linens, and stitched up a tear in Silas's only good shirt. He never asked her to do any of it, but still she moved through the house like someone trying not to leave footprints. Each evening he made sure the lantern outside her room was lit. Each morning she noticed the coffee pot already warm, and still she couldn't quite look him in the eye. One morning she stood by the garden fence, staring out at the frost curling along the early cabbage leaves. Silas approached slow and cautious, like a man who'd learned to speak not with words, but with presence. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently, his breath visible in the chill. "I know," Esther replied. "That's what frightens me." He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She looked down, voice tightening. "When a man is cruel, I know what to expect. When he's distant, I know how to shrink. But when he's kind, I don't know where to put that. I feel like I'm walking barefoot on something I was never allowed to touch." That night she found herself pacing. The house was quiet, the only sound, the soft creak of wood and the low breathing of the fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran them over the mantel, feeling the dents, the age, the use. She wasn't young. She wasn't lovely in the way storybooks demanded. And yet, Silas watched her from the hallway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Do you want to leave?" he asked quietly. She turned to him. Her voice cracked. "I want to stay, but I don't want to be a burden or a rescue or a project." He stepped closer. "You're not." 3 words, no ornaments, but they hit deeper than any poem ever had. Still, that night in bed, Esther lay awake for hours. Her heart wouldn't settle, because the truth was she wanted to touch his hand when they passed by each other in the hall. She wanted to ask what his favorite season was. She wanted to know if he'd ever been loved without being needed. But wanting was dangerous, because every time she'd wanted something good in the past, it ended with silence, or shame, or someone walking away before she could finish her sentence. So she curled up tighter like a woman bracing for a blow that never came. When you've built a life on surviving, how do you learn to rest in something gentle? It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning where the sky was pearl gray and the frost clung like lace to the porch rail. Esther had risen early like always and brewed the coffee. But something in the way the light poured through the kitchen window made her pause. She stood there motionless, staring at her own hands. They were still gloved, always gloved, even when cooking, even when washing. It had been years since anyone had seen her hands bare. Not since her first husband mocked how wide her fingers were, how red and raw from labor. "Farmer's hands," he had sneered. Not exactly soft like a lady's, that was a lifetime ago. But some echoes outlived the rooms they were shouted in. She sat at the table and slowly slid one glove off, then the other. Her fingers were strong with small scars and soft creases, not beautiful by society's rules, but honest, capable, alive. When Silas walked in moments later, his eyes went straight to them. He didn't stare. He didn't comment. He simply pulled out the chair opposite her and said, "They suit you." Later that afternoon, Esther surprised herself. She asked to join him in the barn, not to help, but just to be near. She stood while he brushed down the horses, her hands resting lightly on the stable door. "You always work this much?" she asked. Silas chuckled. "Only when I need to think less and feel more." She nodded. "I used to quilt for that." There was a pause, not heavy, just thoughtful. "Still got thread and fingers, don't you?" he asked. That night she found the old basket in the guest room, the one she'd packed out of habit, not hope. She began stitching again. not because she had to, but because it reminded her of who she'd been before the bruises, the labels, the silence. When she stepped onto the porch, later quilt in lap moonlight tracing her features, Silas brought her tea. No words, just presence. She took the cup with bare hands, and for the first time in years she didn't flinch at being touched, not by the cup, not by the cold, not by the gaze of a man who saw her as she was and still came closer. Sometimes healing begins not with a speech but with the sound of thread passing through cloth, and no one asking you to stop. Spring came to Sweetwater Ridge, not with thunder but with gentleness. The wildflowers were late that year, but the creek thawed early. Birds returned to the cottonwoods, and Esther began leaving her window open at night just enough to let the wind sing its soft lullaby. She stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Silas had never once made her feel like she had to earn the right to stay. One quiet morning, he brought her a small clay pot with a single sprout in it. "Tomato," he said, placing it in her hands. "Not much yet, but it'll come along." She blinked. "What do I do with it?" "You keep it close," he said, "and when it's ready, you plant it." She looked down at the seedling, small, unsure, brave, just like her. That evening they sat on the porch together, the quilt she'd sewn tucked across both laps. Silas sipped his coffee. She held a cup of peppermint tea. The silence wasn't awkward now. It had become a third companion, trustworthy, warm present. After a long while, Esther turned to him. Her voice was steady. Not shy, not timid, just real. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the last of the light stretching across the pasture. "I used to think next meant louder, bigger, a change you could brag about." He paused. "But now, I think it might just mean 2 chairs side by side, and someone to pour the second cup." She smiled, then not with surprise, but with recognition. "As long as I can pour the first cup sometimes," she said. He smiled back. "Deal." That night she placed her gloves in the bottom drawer, not as a symbol, not to prove anything, but because she didn't need them anymore. No one was going to ask her to be smaller, softer, less. She could speak. She could sit still. She could love not in a desperate way, not as a plea, but as a quiet choosing. Because sometimes the miracle isn't being rescued. It's realizing you were never broken to begin with. Would you stay for another story? It took nearly 3 months before Esther agreed to go back into town. Not because she was afraid of wagging tongues, though she remembered them all, but because her heart had been too tender, too new. Healing, after all, is not a sprint. It's a slow unraveling, then reweaving. But that morning, Silas mentioned needing seed from the mercantile. He offered to go alone, as he always had. She folded the laundry with calm hands, then said, "No, I'll come with you." They rode in silence for a while. The trail was familiar, but the wind felt different, as if it too sensed the weight of the return. When they reached the general store, the porch went still. Eyes turned. 2 older women leaned in to whisper. A man in suspenders tipped his hat with a smile too wide, too false. Esther stepped down first. Her posture was not proud, but whole. She didn't rush. She didn't hide. Inside, the storekeeper, Harlan Briggs, looked up and blinked twice. "Well, now," he said, "ain't seen you around since that mix-up last fall." He meant the mail order scam. Everyone knew. Everyone had gossiped. Esther met his gaze squarely. "Yes, and I expect by now you've all had your fill of the joke." A beat of silence. Then she added, quieter, "I may have been tricked, but I'm not ashamed. I showed up in good faith, which is more than I can say for the man who wrote those letters." Briggs cleared his throat. "Well, that's fair." She paid for the seed, took her time, and when a girl behind the counter no older than 20 leaned over and said, "You look nice today," Esther smiled, not with disbelief, but with ease. Back at the wagon, Silas looked at her hands resting calmly in her lap. "You all right?" She nodded. "I didn't melt." He grinned. "Didn't figure you would." That night, as they shelled peas on the porch, Esther said, "You know what hurt most?" "Back then?" Silas shook his head. "It wasn't that they mocked my size, or that I was lied to. It was the silence after how no one stepped forward to say I deserved better." He said nothing at first, then placed his hand gently over hers, not to cover it, but to match it. "I hope you believe it now," he said. "I'm starting to," she whispered. And the stars above Sweetwater Ridge blinked their silent approval. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show your face in a place that once made you feel small and realize you've outgrown their judgment. Summer came to Sweetwater Ridge in golden hushes. The days lengthened, the hens laid more. The tomatoes bloomed bright and stubborn, And Esther found herself humming again, not for show, not to chase away silence, but simply because the mornings asked for song. One afternoon, while pinning linens to the line, Esther paused. There on the porch rail was a small wooden sign, hand-carved letters, imperfect. It read, Esther's Porch. She stared at it. Silas, just returning from the well, scratched the back of his neck. I figured since you sit out there every evening, might as well make it official. She said nothing at first. Then, still holding a clothespin, she looked up and asked softly, Does that mean I'm staying? He smiled, not with triumph, but with that quiet steadiness she had come to know as love. No, ma'am. It means you already have. That night they sat beneath the cottonwood tree. No porch, no rocking chairs, just the ground, the quilt, and the stars. She leaned her head to his shoulder. You know, she said, you never once asked me about my past. I figured you'd tell it when it stopped hurting, he said. She nodded. Maybe someday I will. And maybe someday I'll tell you why I never married, he added. A soft breeze passed. The grass swayed, and neither rushed the other's silence. They built no wedding, planted no flag. But when Esther caught a fever in September, and he sat beside her through 3 nights straight when he made her soup with too much salt, and she still drank every drop when she mended his old coat without being asked, and he carved her name slowly into the barn wall beside his sister's, that's when she knew. She didn't need proof of love, she was living in it. Because sometimes love doesn't knock or declare, it just stays. Quiet, faithful, soft as a hand resting on yours when the world goes dim. Would you stay for another story? Sometimes love doesn't come with violins. It doesn't knock on the door with flowers or make grand speeches under moonlight. Sometimes it looks like a quiet man who leaves the porch light on. A woman who takes off her gloves not to impress, but because she finally feels safe. A quilt across 2 laps, a seedling in a clay pot growing slow and steady. Esther was mocked, abandoned, called too much for someone else's small heart. But she found a home not because someone rescued her, but because someone simply saw her and stayed. We hope her story reminded you, you are not too late, you are not too much, and you are never wrong for hoping that someone someday will choose you just as you are. If this story brought you comfort, we invite you to subscribe to None Wild West Saga, where we tell gentle stories of second chances, quiet healing, and late blooming love. Share this with someone who's still waiting for their porch light moment, and tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next for Esther and Silas, or hear another story of quiet love in a forgotten corner of the West? We'd love to sit beside you for the next tale. After all, stories like healing are best shared slowly and together.